Welcome to Never Again is Now, a podcast about anti-Semitism. I'm Evelyn Marcus, and in addition to being a psychologist, I'm featured in the documentary about anti-Semitism, Never Again is Now. I am a Dutch Jew and a daughter of Holocaust survivors. In 2006, I immigrated to the United States because of the rising anti-Semitism in Europe.
I am Phyllis Zimbler Miller, the founder of the free nonfiction Holocaust theater project, thinedgethewedge.com. I grew up in a small town in the Midwest, where in the small Jewish community, our parents and grandparents had come to Europe to escape the Tsar at the turn of the 20th century. But in 1970, only 25 years after the end of World War II, my U.S. Army officer husband and I found ourselves stationed in Munich, Germany. This changed our lives forever.
Randy Fried is a Jewish communal professional based in Los Angeles. He's the director of philanthropic engagement and communication at Tzedek America, an organization that seeks to strengthen Jewish identity. Randy is active in the World Jewish Congress, from where he has global and local conversations on issues central to the Jewish people. Randy is an advocate for Holocaust education and a senior educator of groups at March of the Living. And he's an elected official at the City of Los Angeles. Randy, it's a pleasure to have you on our show. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Very happy to be here.
So our first question to you is whether you can tell us a little bit about your personal background and how it influenced your choice of working in the interest of the Jewish community.
Great question, and I'll try to be brief since my wife says I talk a lot. So I was born in Hawaiian Gardens, California. I was adopted at birth. My parents were first and second generation born Jews from Eastern Europe. So of course it's my family. It's all I knew and know. And the subject of the Holocaust is very interesting. So I was coming up, I was always interested in history. I was always interested in connecting with seniors in our synagogue community. And I was in high school when Schindler's List came out. So that was, I was already interested in the subject. That sparked more interest. I was active in United Synagogue Youth. And in 1995, I spent a summer of 3 weeks touring in Eastern Europe and 3 weeks touring in Israel. And that as well gave me that experiential, educational time in my life, right? As a junior in high school was also very influential. And then there was a picture. There was a picture that I should have actually grabbed, but a picture of my great-grandmother on my mother's side. And there's a recording of her when she was interviewed in 1973 before I was born. And she's talking about her brother who dies in a pogrom in Russia prior to the war. And that was a moment that that side of the family leaves Russia. So then I started asking more questions. And my paternal grandfather's, though he came to America well before the war, he had an older sister who remained. And there were letters back and forth, but eventually the letters that he sent went unanswered. And so in the early years of college, I wanted to see, well, what happened? And as it turns out, that side of the family, it's as if they never existed. And though I didn't know these people, as a Jew, it was something that I felt deeply connected to. And just as I had a unique experience of traveling and seeing these sites firsthand and meeting with survivors firsthand, I have engaged in not only in learning, like all these books behind me, they're all largely Holocaust-related books, but moreover to Jewish history of Poland, and it's now become a passion of mine.
That leads naturally into the March of Living trip. Could you describe to our listeners what the trip entails, what age the students are, and what the impact is on these people who participate?
Sure. So the International March of the Living is the umbrella organization that coming up on 35 years, next year will be the 35th anniversary of the March of the Living, is an experiential educational program that takes Jewish teenagers from all over the world for a week in Poland. Some come for a little less, but usually a week in Poland. And then a number of delegations will continue on and spend a week in Israel. We are now inclusive of adult groups, young professional groups, and we are always in Poland over Yom HaShoah, so Holocaust Remembrance. And then in Israel, many delegations come to Israel in time for Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut, the Memorial Day in Israel, and Israel's Independence Day. So I have been involved with that program. My first march was in 2008. And I've been participating with the march as an educator ever since, but during the pandemic, the trip was canceled. We returned this year only to Israel because of the conflict in Eastern Europe, but we are planning to be in Poland next year. In terms of the impact, it's a really great question. And after 35 years of the march, it's given us a great opportunity to really look, and even anecdotally on my own, knowing participants from 2008, and now they have graduated college, gone to some to grad school, started families of their own, to come back and say, what is the impact? And I think the impact is really twofold. One is that a number of them really embrace the motto of the Bureau, or now the Builders of Jewish Education in Los Angeles, which is to remember, to educate, and to act. And the notion that it's not simply enough to light a candle for Yom HaShoah in your home. It is not enough to simply make a tweet, although helpful. But what really matters is acting, engaging in dialogue, engaging in advocacy, engaging with your community or the greater community to talk about the issue of anti-Semitism. I think that the program has given participants, one, a greater sense of their own Jewish identity. And we see that through participants, even who have been to Israel before, spending time in Poland and learning about the near 1,000 years of history of Jews thriving largely in Poland for nearly 1,000 years. And then there's no right word to describe the tragedy and the horror of the Shoah, and then going to Israel. That also gives them, it's as if they're seeing Israel for the first time, and shifts the lens through which they look at the state of Israel. And so I think we're making better connected Jews, hopefully, to each other and to the world around them.
So do I understand well, Randy, that it is in the same trip that they visit Auschwitz and they visit Israel? Is that correct?
That is correct.
Yeah, that's very powerful, right? Very powerful. I can imagine that.
I think what makes it really powerful, I'll just say briefly, is an idea that, for example, we talk about, and a colleague of mine, she always gives a beautiful, Michal Porat-Zinman, who's an educator out of Israel. She loves to talk about that survivors out of the Shoah, if you really think about it, they come to Israel, and one could argue that when there was a need for them to defend this fledgling state of Israel, they could have said, I've done enough. The sheer fact that I survived, I have done enough. Or maybe even, I don't want to go to Israel. I've survived. That's it. I've given my lot, or what it was due. And instead, the survivors dusted off their dream of founding the state of Israel that they had put on the shelf during the war, and just resumed pursuing their dream and their hope for returning home and creating a Jewish nation. And I think that also is very inspirational for teenagers who, on a very much smaller scale, but still impactful to them, have their own perceptions of challenges in their lives and what to do and roadblocks. It's very inspirational for them.
This is connected then to Holocaust education in the United States, because it's interesting what these students know about the Holocaust before they come on the trip and what they then add to their knowledge. So, what do you think about the effectiveness of Holocaust education in the United States today? And do you have suggestions for how to improve it?
All right, how much time do we have? No, it's a big listen. The two of you, I'm sure, have seen the Pew study that came out a couple of years ago, and seeing how much, or frankly, how little, most American teenagers know about the Holocaust. To get them to readily identify Auschwitz, even, or
Yeah.
who made up the Axis powers, or who is Hitler, or et cetera, et cetera. Sadly, scary as it is, they don't know. And this is in California, we have mandated Holocaust education, K through 12. It's required by the state. And if we zoom out and look at the nation, currently only 23 states have some level of requirement of Holocaust education in K through 12. And so our programming, a lot of our kids specifically, so they're high school seniors largely who come on our program, come from high schools all across Los Angeles, because we're just one delegation of many that come from the United States and the world. The private Jewish school kids tend to know more, but broadly speaking, there's a number of Jews that have that in their own family history, right? 60 to 70% of all American Jews can trace their lineage to Poland. So a lot of them have some link. So it does have an impact. Also because we choose to teach about the Holocaust. I choose to teach about the Holocaust one by one. If you were to sit back and ask yourself, how many people could you name that perished in the Holocaust? Most people can't name. Usually, if we're lucky with a high school kid, they'll say Anne Frank because they read the book in school. Maybe Janusz Korczak, they'll get to 2. But to really know and name a victim, where were they from? What was their story? They don't. And I think that the way that when we think about Holocaust education, the way that we can make it connective and the way that we can easily spread teaching the lessons of the Shoah is learning about an individual.
I'm reading Daniel Mendelssohn's book, The Lost, 6 of 6 million, which came out several years ago. And that's also what he talks about. I can't say that word, but being very specific about individuals. And so and my play also is a firsthand testimony to make it very clear to young people. These are people that are like themselves, that were their ages, and this is what they went through. So how can we spread that information even more than the way it's being done in the United States right now? Particularly, I'm more concerned because I grew up in a town with almost no Jews. I was the only Jewish kid in my class. How can we do this not with Jewish kids who go on March to the Living, but with non-Jewish kids? Even when Holocaust education is mandated, it frequently is not really taught, even more than a couple hours in a year or something. So what can we do?
Right, it's a couple pages in a history book. I think it's a few things. I think that number one, anyone who is, whether they're Jewish or not Jewish, should care about the issue of anti-Semitism. As the head of the NAACP said shortly after Charlottesville, and the World Jewish Congress, which I'm a part of, we moderated a conversation. It was a virtual conference on race, a global conference on racism, and he said the bigotry and hatred comes from both those in Charlottesville, those marching with tiki torches, and that hate is hate in that sense, and we should be working to create more alliances with non-Jewish communities to spread awareness and to teach. So with that in mind, the March of the Living does include delegations of non-Jews. In fact, this year, there were no delegations, or very few delegations, that went to Poland because of the conflict with Ukraine and Russia. And there were several thousand people, and the majority of whom were from Germany, were from Poland, and these are German and Polish youth, young adults. And so there's already a recognition, for example, from the March of the Living, that we have to incorporate as many allies and friends as we can outside of our community to recognize that it's a problem. The World Jewish Congress, similarly, which as a WJC representative, I know you interviewed Leon previously, talked about that on the global stage, the WJC professional staff are dealing with issues concerning Jewish communities around the world. Dovetailing into that is the World Jewish Congress Jewish Diplomatic Corps, which is the flagship program of the WJC, which are young-ish, I don't know if I can call myself young anymore, between 25 and 45 Jewish professionals, or they are active in their Jewish communities in some fashion or form. And we are really that grassroots. There's about 350 of us now spread across the world. And we are, as Ronald Lauder would say, our president, Ambassador Lauder would say, we are the eyes and ears on the ground in our respective communities to report back to the WJC when there are issues arise, number one, and number two, where there are opportunities for us to work together and create programs in our own communities on a very local level.
As a member of the Jewish Diplomatic Corps at the World Jewish Congress, you traveled to the United Arab Emirates, the UAE. Could you tell us about that trip?
Sure. So it was really birthed out of the idea of Ambassador Yusuf Otaiba, who is the UAE ambassador in DC, and this idea that, along with the World Jewish Congress and Ambassador Lauder, this idea that now that the Abraham Accords have been signed, from the UAE point of view, they should begin to create relationships with the Jewish diaspora and large Jewish organizations. So, of course, that includes the World Jewish Congress, because the World Jewish Congress is unique in that it is a representative body of over 100 Jewish communities across the world, on a national level, right? So over 100 nations. And in fact, I believe the UAE was officially 113. They were the latest member to join. And the idea was, after the Abraham Accords, there was a leadership bridge building program. And so a cohort of about 30 members of the World Jewish Congress, which JD Corps, which I was lucky enough and honored to be a part of, we started having regular meetings talking about issues of what are the existing political dynamic in the Middle East, in the Levant, the birth of Arab countries, the dynamics of the history of the UAE, et cetera, and then culminating with a diplomatic mission to the UAE in November of last year. We were guests of the UAE government. It was an incredible trip. I will admit that as a Jew in Los Angeles, my expectation was that Arabs in the Gulf, on either they really hate Jews to a level that it animates physical violence, or at best, they still don't like Jews at all. And I'm happy to say that I was wrong, that the Emiratis have created and believe in, very much so, and not just top down, but from bottom up, having a very tolerant society. So, for example, the Mormon Church is building they're going to be building a church there where the World Expo was, and it will be called Expo City, and they're building a church there. There are Sikhs, there are Buddhists, there are Jews, other denominations of Christianity that are in the country. Yes, it is an Islamic country. Yes, of course, like any country, there are challenges where you deal with the push and pull of how do they honor the traditions and beliefs of Sheikh Zayed, the founder, and those older traditions, while pushing forward to modernity. A lot of things people don't realize. For example, they have a legislative body that's required by law, 50% must be women. They, at the World Expo, they insisted on building a pavilion dedicated to dedicated to women and the contributions women have made to the world. So it isn't to say that it's a perfect country, but in terms of the Jewish dynamic, they're very tolerant. They're much more interested in how are you as a person? Are you honest? And is there an opportunity to work together and make something better together?
Well, that's great news. And did you also, are there synagogues now in the Emirates?
So that's actually a very funny story. Well, two things. The short answer is they're being built. One is in celebration of the Abrahamic faiths, the UAE government has set out to build a complex in Abu Dhabi that is going to be a mosque, a church, and a synagogue, all the same size. They're enormous, but all the exact same. Each building will have the same footprint, same occupancy, and this is symbolically very important because we know in the ancient world, for example, in Europe, in Eastern Europe during the Shoah, and many of the old shtetls and smaller towns, for example, if you go to Tikocin, the tallest building by municipal code has to be the church.
Yeah.
So the synagogue in Tikocin, enterprising Jews, they started their building below grade. So technically it's taller, but it's not because the top of the synagogue had to be lower than the church.
Same thing in the Islamic world compared to mosques.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. And so this is an Islamic nation saying, no, we should be celebrating all three faiths equally, that they have equal standing. And they will be in the same plaza, a part of the same greater complex. And so that's one synagogue that's being built by the government. And yes, there are permits that have been applied for. The Jewish community in Dubai has been operating out of the Four Seasons, but they have a permit now to build a synagogue. And in Abu Dhabi, there is too. One of the jokes related by the new Israeli ambassador was, anytime a religious community went to the UAE government and said, we want to build a house of worship, the UAE government would talk about it. It has to look nice, et cetera. And they would say, who's going to be our contact person? And the Mormons would say, okay, this person's our contact person. And the Sikhs would say, okay, this person. And when they said for the Jews, okay, who's going to be our contact person? 5 Jews raised their hand. And there was immediately disagreements. And the Emiratis went back to the Israeli ambassador and said, we need your help. We've never encountered this before. There's, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. But yes, there are permits of building. One
That's
in Abu
also
Dhabi.
great news. That's also great news.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now let's move on to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism. And it's been adopted by a lot of countries. Evan and I have talked about it a lot on our program, even on our YouTube homepage. We have the link. But as part of the Jewish Diplomatic Corps, you discuss this with people. And who do you discuss it with? And how do you help? Well, you might want to explain to our listeners who haven't heard our other podcasts
Sure.
what it is. And then how you kind of get people to understand how they can implement it.
Ooh, okay. So the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which is born out of a really international body, largely coming out of the EU, and talking about how can we define anti-Semitism? Can we have a working definition of anti-Semitism to use that as a tool to help nations work together and versus recreating the wheel each time to define anti-Semitism and how do we know it is what it is? And it has gone through a couple iterations, and there are currently, so there's the definition, and then there are the 11 examples of that definition in action. And 7 of those 11 definitions talk about issues of Israel, because I feel I could make a great argument, and I think many could as well, that yes, you're allowed to criticize the Israeli government. Just go to Israel. There's plenty of people criticizing their own government. And it is a very vigorous democracy, right? They're going into their 5th election in 4 years. Nevertheless, a lot of the criticism, if we just look under the hood, and oftentimes not even under the hood of the criticism and what's around it, it is actually just the latest iteration of trying to delegitimize the actual state of Israel and a form of anti-Semitism, decouple the notion that Jews are indigenous to Judea, so on and so forth. So for me, as a member of the WJC, it being in the United States, I don't talk often about the IHRA. I tend to attack the issues of, that places like Georgia and Savannah, where it's a small Jewish community, and Atlanta, where there's a small Jewish community, but it's a mighty community. They don't talk about the Holocaust in the state, and let's figure out how we can improve that. Georgia doesn't require it, or in Mississippi, or in Nevada doesn't talk about it, or Hawaii, a liberal state, doesn't talk about the Holocaust in education. Where I have had opportunity, so in 2020, the World Jewish Congress hosted, for the International Holocaust Remembrance, they hosted a huge memorial event in Poland, in Krakow, and
January of 2020.
January of 2020, yes. And so there, for example, I was a colleague and I talked with a group of young professionals about the IHRA definition. The young professionals were from all across Europe. And we talked about, number one, what is the definition? And then number two, how do we implement it? And I think the answer to that is each country, it's a little different, I think, because of how their governments function and their relationship with their Jews, right? As something I chatted with Evelyn, anti-Semitism in the US, although education is the answer to all of it, how we get to bringing that education in is different, let's say in the US versus in Austria versus in Italy, and so on. So what I talk about, I would say, is more internally with other JDs. For example, I think I'm a member of, I don't know, half a dozen or to a dozen different WhatsApp groups through the JD Core, and one of them on anti-Semitism. We are constantly talking about and bringing issues to the fore to discuss internally, and then hopefully helping empower the JDs that are on the ground confronting the issue, to give them support to address it and hopefully improve the situation, whatever that may be.
But what is it you discuss as the Jewish diplomatic corps with professionals internationally about this definition that includes certain criticisms of Israel that cross the line of
so what do we discuss? I mean, I think it's twofold. One, I think it's largely around having an open dialogue to illustrate how the criticism against Israel, as one side would say it is, to say, in fact, how it is more than just that. It's more sinister than that. And there is patent anti-Semitism. For example, those who are marching for Palestinian rights, we see it all over Europe, but we see it all over America more and more as well. From the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free. By that very phrase, people are saying and advocating that the state of Israel should not exist. So number one, where else in the world can we point to any other nation where there are people advocating for it to disappear? Number one. And number two, where do we see, it just coincidentally happens to be, right, the only Jewish country in the world, and just coincidentally is the only one that people are saying shouldn't exist. And so some of the conversation is about how can we facilitate a conversation with policymakers and give them a much bigger list, an illustrative list of how the rhetoric is more than just criticism of Israel. It's the same thing, by the way, that happens here. We had, for example, here in Los Angeles, you'll remember last year, there were people minding their own business, eating sushi, and a convoy of cars pulled up coming from the Inland Empire. You have to really hate Jews to drive through LA traffic, coming for over an hour. And it's the same thing. They weren't saying who here supports the Likud government, who here supports Netanyahu, who here supports the military conflict between Israel and Hamas. They were saying, free Palestine, who's a Jew? And so it's a great example to say, well, are they really concerned about the policies of Israel, or are they concerned about, or is that just kind of an easier framework that maybe they can get people to buy into? And it's actually that they don't like Jews. And so the World Jewish Congress JD Core, we take these issues, we open them up, we discuss them, and we will go after. For example, there is a professor, Gideon Grief, who denies the Bosnia that there was ever genocide in Bosnia and Croatia, and he was about to be brought on as a speaker of a large bureau of speakers in Israel. And so one JD noted that this was about to happen. So that JD reached out to the JD Core, as well as World Jewish Congress professional staff. And we all, whether it was a letter writing campaign to the CEO, to members of government, to the board of directors, identifying one, who we are, and two, outlining why this person is problematic for an organization. Or if there's a speaker coming to a university, we try to, again, engage in a conversation and say, well, this is why we as representatives of Jewish communities from around the world think it's a problem. Oftentimes we're listened to, but oftentimes people might decide otherwise. I think we're fortunate that for the most part, though there are still plenty of challenges, too many challenges, we're able to engage in conversation.
Very good, very good, very good to know also. So you're also involved in strengthening the Black-Jewish relationship in the United States. Is that also with the World Jewish Congress? And can you tell us more about it?
So some of that has been on the local level, just one interacting with local chapters, the NAACP, and Cornell Brooks, Professor Brooks, when he was a part of a panel that I interviewed him, we were talking about, I asked the question of what happened? When did our communities break up? Because we have a very noted history
Yes.
of working together.
Very good question.
And by the way, I love the way he speaks. He smiled and he said, Randy, I'm an eternal optimist. And he said, though undernoted, the history is still there. And he said, I'll ask you. He said, Randy, how many members of the Black community are on Jewish boards, Jewish organization boards that are out-facing organizations? How many Jews? And he said, how many members of the Black community are on the board of the World Jewish Congress? So I mean, he threw it right back, and he said, if we're not engaging on that level, so that we can create opportunities for younger people to interact, how are we supposed to expect them to interact if we're supposed to be the leaders in showing them the way? And I can say, for example, my own professional work with Tzedek America, we tackle social justice issues through a Jewish lens, which includes issues of racism and history of civil rights. And so, for example, a poignant story, we had 100 Jewish students, a bunch of largely white Jewish kids. We took them to the South, touring the South. They were in LaGrange, Georgia, outside of Atlanta, which has a very nasty history. And there are plaques around LaGrange of where people were lynched. And we took them to a specific plaque to learn about a specific victim. You'll notice that's almost like a callback to how we teach about the Holocaust. They learned all about this victim who was lynched. But then they also interacted with a descendant of the person who was lynched. They interacted with members of the police department of LaGrange today, and how that police department is grappling with its history and trying to change and interact with the community and members of the community. Because if we don't create or we take Jewish teens and we go down into South LA and we interact with people from Faithful Central, one of the largest Black churches in the city, we go to local stores and shop owners and we interact, because if we're not building a relationship at that level and starting just the conversation, because some of these people have never met a Jew, then it's easier to believe we're these horrible monsters that people want to say we are. But if you break bread with someone and if you have a conversation, and it's like, hey, I have the same shoes.
Yes.
I don't like cilantro in my guacamole either.
Yes.
Whatever it is, we create a relationship. And my hope is that in that way, it's a basis of improving the relationship and combating anti-Semitism.
Yes.
Okay.
We're coming to the end of the interview, so I'm going to give you a chance for your last thoughts. But if you also would like to include in that, are there any specifics of what our listeners can do as individuals to speak up against anti-Semitism?
Yeah. So first, I would just go back to what the Builders of Jewish Education in Los Angeles motto is around the March of the Living, which is to remember, educate, and act. And for this, something that every individual can do is they can speak out when there's hate. We all probably would admit that we've heard racist jokes. We probably would all admit potentially that we even laughed at a racist joke. But the Holocaust didn't start
Started with
with
words.
Auschwitz falling out of the sky. It started with words. And so I think we need to really think about the words that we use and be willing to speak out and say when hate is not allowed. And in any section, anti-Semitism unfortunately has become in many ways mainstream, and it's kind of okay. Were you able to Jew down the price? Were you all the things that we hear that people think are funny? To be able to speak out and say it's not funny. So that's the simplest. And then the second is to really find a Jewish community if you're not a part of one, and for non-Jews, and start a relationship, start a conversation. And as Jews, we should be going out and starting a conversation with all of our neighbors. We are part of this greater community, and if we want people to support us, we have to speak out together.
Very well said. We have to speak out together as individuals. So thank you, Randy, so much. This has been really an enlightening conversation. Thank you for our listeners. I urge any of our listeners who have not yet seen Evelyn's documentary, Never Again Is Now, please do so. You will learn a lot and you'll be inspired to speak up. You can watch it on Amazon and YouTube. And more information about my free nonfiction Holocaust theater project, firsthand testimony of survivors and saviors, is at thinedgeofthewedge.com. And everyone, remember, if you can do this without putting yourself in physical harm, speak up against anti-Semitism and all hate. Thank you.
Thank you.
No.